in the early 20s, when the whole community was being dried out, transformed from a swamp to buildable ground, they had lots of workers, and the workers brought families, and they needed to have schools almost immediately. That meant temporary structures. The first temporary structure was at a place called the Community House, which is where today's YMCA is located. And it was a ramshackle structure. The church met there, the school met there, and it was kind of a community headquarters, but it was not in very good shape.
There was an old building on Oregon Way that was housed the first school for kids in Longview when Longview started. And then they built Kessler, and then it evolved that Kessler had the grade school on the left end as you looked at the school, the auditorium in the middle, and the junior high school and the high school.
One of the Longview businessmen had donated a building and a few chairs for the black children, but the other parents didn't like the conditions, so they sent their children back from wherever they had came from. And my mom sent my brothers back to California to stay with her sister until she needed to get her family together and decided, you know, this was the way to do it. In 1924, Mrs. Freeman broke the color barrier. She had two sons, Oliver and Calvin Smith. She took them to the newly opened Kessler School and asked that they be enrolled. They were admitted, though reluctantly, because the principal could foresee trouble. Mrs. Freeman had gone first to see J.H. Seacrest. Seacrest had told her to take the boys to school, and if any difficulties arose, to call him.
When the church started in 1923, didn't have a building, represented about 19 different religious groups, and so it was pretty representative of the whole community. It was a community church, and there was no place to meet, so we held worship. They held worship services at the YMCA, and had a Sunday school that at times exceeded over 1,000 that met at Kessler School, because Kessler School could handle that.
And then R.A. Long said it's time to build a high school for the older kids.
My aunt was in the first class to graduate from R.A. Long. However, there were no seats in the auditorium at that time. So for the graduation program, they brought in chairs and sat people there. My dad was in the first class to actually attend R.A. Long and graduate from there.
In the 1920s, we had community celebrations called Pageants of Progress, in which they proudly proclaimed the intent that Longview would grow to 100,000 people within a short period of time. But by late 1928, sales for timber was already beginning to slacken. And there were some warning signals within the industry. Right at the time when Long Bell was deeply in debt, having invested so heavily in building a community. However, they made a commitment to the community. They would not lay people off. They would gradually cut back on hours.
The depression to us was that we all ate still. The thing is, when everybody is hit at once, it isn't as bad. Everybody around you has been really successful and is rich. Then you feel poor. But when everybody's poor, you know, you don't think of it very much.
Starting with St. Helens, I don't remember a lot about it because this was in the heart of the Depression. 1932, but I do remember the back play area was made out of sand and gravel, and in the center and off to a little bit to the right when you went out to play was a huge burning barrel, concrete, must have been 5 or 6 feet tall, without a top on it.
I started in Kessler School, and I started in 1932. I was 6 years old, and I remember we always had a group that played house, and it was down in the sand. Of course, around Kessler School there were no houses. Every morning we had a health check, and you had to show the school nurse your tongue, and you also had to have a clean handkerchief. I had never been to a movie, and they took the whole school, all 1,000 students, and we walked from the school to the Columbia Theater.
I can remember at my tender age of remembering the bells pealing on the community church. And we were all excited. What's going on? Was it a celebration? What? And the teacher said, Mr. Long passed away. She then turned around and began to tell us the story of R.A. Long and the city of Longview, how he donated so much to make this city the dream planned city that he'd always hoped for.
We were just petrified to go to high school because that was such a big school.
Freshmen, we were always in the balcony. The sophomores, juniors, and seniors were downstairs at R.A. Long, and in the balcony were the freshmen. And the freshmen were usually the larger of the classes.
And we actually had a moving ceremony at the last part of the school. The seniors would all go onto the stage, freshmen would come downstairs, and everybody moves one section of the auditorium.
We had border control, which took care of people walking in and greeting them at the entrance and in the hall. You had to have a pass to move through the hallways.
Jane Taylor became the first junior girl ever to be elected president of the Board of Control when she defeated Jerry Lee Sr. in a special election. Of course, we thought that was something wonderful because Jane Taylor was in our class, you know.
It was the first year at Kessler, my first year at Kessler, when World War II was started. Pudgy little Gene Sylvie came tearing through the door to get my attention. He had gone home for lunch, and he was coming almost breathless through that door. They're bombing Vanilla, Miss Hall. They're bombing Vanilla.
We had a Japanese student, and during the war, all of a sudden he didn't come. And that night, they had rounded up all the Japanese and taken them away. And that really hurt all of us. That was very shocking to us.
Earl Reed later on told me, and he was a principal of R.A. Long at the time, that these children were taken from school and they came into his office. And Mr. Reed choked up and cried. He says, take your clothes, everything, return the books, give us your keys. You were leaving the school, I'm sorry. That's all he had to say.
The whole atmosphere in Longview was very pertinent to the war and what was going on. And in fact, in our classrooms, in elementary school especially, every week, like on Monday for instance, we'd bring a dime and we bought a 10-cent war stamp.
There were scrap drives for metal, for rubber, scrap drives for paper.
The kids would get together and they'd go door to door asking for all the old newspapers that people had.
We had war drills where the teachers would walk you out, and then the students would lay down by the curb for protection.
So we placed red boxes in the hallway filled with sand to put out in case a fire or a bomb came through, and we could put it out, supposedly dumping sand on it.
A lot of our students worked in the mills. They went all day to school, and then they could work a half shift in the mills.
And that gave them extra money because most of the men were in the service or working in defense jobs. The wood shop with Carl Stahlberg was active in making model airplanes. Each plane was designed to look exactly as a replica of those that were in the war. They were shipped out, first of all, to air raid warden spots across the country and also to the military bases where these people were training to spot planes in the air and know the difference between foe and friendly. There was an F-4F, which was a Hellcat, in the back mechanical part of the school. The students would learn how to take the plane apart, put it together. They'd never fly, but they kept this up.
In doing the archive room, I came across a letter from the War Department letting the school know that there was a shortage of .22 caliber ammunition and that they were to cease using it. I came across another letter that was dated October of 1942 saying a limited supply of caliber 22 ammunition is being made available pursuant to recommendation of the War Production Board exclusively for the use of National Rifle Association. So what they basically told the school is that they had to register now with the National Rifle Association in order to get any of that ammunition.
When our senior year came, we just so much wanted an annual, and there wasn't enough paper, can you believe it, in a paper town, and we couldn't use it for that frivolous purpose. So we went to Mr. Reed, who was the principal at that time. Mr. Reed said, well, let's see what we can do about it. So we scurried around and went to all the places that he said we should to find out about things. Well, we had an annual made, but it's the very different one, because we couldn't get hardback on an annual. We have kind of a velvety paper that is the annual.
Longview was starting to celebrate its 25th anniversary, and we had a birthday cake in Longview that was a big round tiered birthday cake, and with some of the gals from RA Long with formals on would ride periodically around the cake and in the parade. Well, but then we had to postpone it because of the flood that happened.
48 was my graduation time, and the freeway between Longview and Portland was wiped out. So traffic had to go over the Rainier Bridge and down the Oregon side. So my graduation gown was late. I didn't think I'd get one.
My dad was the purchasing agent at the old straw board before it burned down, and he had me down there sandbagging and filling up sandbags on the dike next to the plant.
A cousin of mine myself volunteered to be on dike patrol at night. We'd take flashlights and down around the dikes in Cowlitz River, so forth. We'd walk around with our flashlights, listening for gurgling or leaking things, and so we'd spread the word that there was a weakness here that had to be corrected. They needed all the manpower they could get to stymie the flooding areas and so on, and the buses couldn't go, and the traffic was snarled up, and it just came to kind of a halt, and allowed the recovery period in there for the schools too.
Football was the big item for RA Long at that time.
The whole week's build-up for the Turkey Day games was a lot of fun. You know, there were rallies at both cities, and we'd sometimes go over to theirs and hang out, you know.
Everybody in town would postpone their turkey dinners until after the game, because we had 5,000 or 5,500 people in the stadium watching the game. So people more than happy to delay their dinners so they could come and watch the game. It was always a knockdown, drag-out battle with Kelso, and the tradition lasted for a long, long time.
I attended St. Helens. There was no Olympic school at the time, and the earthquake occurred, and very damaging. It was a very large earthquake centered in Olympia, but we got a lot of damage here.
They had these big open stairways, and as we were going down, the earthquake hit as we were walking down the steps, and they had a Victrola on wheels, and that Victrola rolled right down, crashed down through the stairway, missed us all.
At RA Long, there's great big windows in association with the stairs as you go down. And I looked out the window, and behind here at RA Long, you could see the ground rolling.
I got on these little wooden backstops in the playground and rode them through the rumbling, and watched the teachers' cars bang into one another at the curb. And then I watched a big crack come down the middle of St. Helens School. So to my knowledge, it was the only school closed as a result of the earthquake. And they moved my 5th and probably the 6th graders to Kessler for the balance of that year.
Post-war years, Times were good in Longview. I mean, four full major mills, all totally employed.
Teachers were at Olympic and at Broadway with classes of 39 plus. There was no such thing as a teacher aide, a teacher assistant, 39 kids, one teacher.
I taught at Kessler, and Kessler, they told me, I'm pretty sure it was pretty true, I probably had the most kids in an elementary school in the state.
Kessler was crowded in those days also, and of course during the war there was no buildings built.
All sixth graders went there at that time, and I think for some years after that, and we had a Christmas concert, and we had everybody in the sixth grade singing Silent Night up in the R.A. Long gym, and we all brought flashlights, and so at the end they turned the lights out and we shined them all over the ceiling.
I went to Kessler for the 5th and the 6th grade, and by then they had Monticello finished.
Monticello was the big step into junior high. You know, it was a big school at that time. We had both of our classes were together, and all 3 grades were there, 7th through 9th.
It probably looks commonplace now, but it was pretty unique in the early 50s. So that was kind of neat because we had windows on 2 sides of our classrooms if you were in that side of the building.
Didn't have as many students as maybe Kessler did, but it was still a big junior high, but they were out of room already when I got there because I taught my health classes in the home ec rooms.
The maypole was, I think, what Monticello was known for. We had every spring they had a big event, and each grade had their separate things that they did. Like the 8th graders did the weaving of the maypole. There were May princesses, and then there was the May queen out of the 9th grade class.
It was fun, you know. I mean, I don't think anybody ever looked at it like, oh, that's kind of childish, you know. They thought it was really a great tradition, you know, and you liked wearing the little roughly fluffy skirts and things like that, because that was what was popular too at that time.
One of the things that I personally value is the relationship with Cal Story in the music program.
Cal Story and the band. When you're talking about Monticello, that's one of my big remembrances is in the 9th grade. Then we joined up with the high school band as 9th graders, and Cal Story was just legendary and doing and excelled at superior bands, both marching and concert bands, and that was a real treat to be able to play with them. I know I wore the R.A. Long band uniform and marched on the football field and on the streets of Longview for the parades, and you were very proud to be part of that band.
It was a great time to be a teenager in Longview in the 50s.
After every basketball game, home game, and after every football home game, there was a dance in the cafeteria. I remember being blessed with live music almost every dance, and they came from our classmates. And it was just when Boogie Woogie was starting to come in and Elvis Presley was starting to show up. So we had, you know, a lot of rock and roll coming in. That was a little bit different, because before that we were dancing to Glenn Miller. When there wasn't a game, or there was kind of an off between seasons, the big thing to do was cruise commerce.
While all of the building of schools, they were trying to frantically get enough space for students in the district. I was over in Korea.
We had a bunch of new teachers that came right out of the service, and I assume that they came right out just after the end of the Korean War. These guys were all coaches, and I would like to call them studs, you know what I mean? And they were great, again, another example of good role models.
It was at Monticello where we all learned that our class would be split.
You got really tight with these kids in junior high school, and then suddenly the boundary changes and Mark Morris is there and they're gone.
I think most of us went to Mark Morris kicking and screaming and tears, and you know, that wasn't fun. Nobody wanted to go there. We wanted to wear the Pep Club sweater or whatever uniforms at RA Long and be part of that tradition.
The last things that are finished in a building are the PE facilities and locker rooms and gym and fields and so on. So you had to use facilities that were just mostly pastures.
I remember Mr. Rebus, our principal, kind of bringing us all into the cafetorium, they called it, because we didn't have an auditorium, we had a cafetorium. He said, okay, kids, long enough you've been crying and feeling sad. Here's the deal. This is what it's going to be, and it's up to you whether you're going to make it or break it. So he gave us a little pep talk, and we just sort of said, okay, that's what we have to do. We have to do. So we set about making this our school. I was on the first student council. I was the historian, although we didn't have any history, so we did have to make some history. We had great teachers. Some of them came over from RA Long. One of them of note was the basketball coach, Joe Moses, and that was, everybody was kind of surprised about that, but he got those basketball traditions going and did a fine job. And I think one of the big highlights is in our junior year when we did beat RA Long. One of the problems with going to a high school that didn't look like a high school was we had elementary kids in D wing and junior high kids in another wing, and we had our own little wing, but we were all together in one big building.
Our own daughter Laura, who was a first grader in 1962-63, went to Mark Morris High School building as a first grader.
Cascade was over at Mark Morris. It was, they all went to school in the same building.
We had a number of very serious assemblies while I was in high school regarding the potential for our armed services, drafts, things like that.
We would have the kids get under desks, and we had a monitor that would close the shades so that there would be hopefully no shards of glass that would get in and damage anybody.
The Columbus Day storm in 1962, I was 10 and a half years old, so going to Kessler School. But the storm had been predicted, and I believe we were off school that Friday when the storm hit. I remember watching the storm from our living room window.
That actually lifted the roof of the grandstand off and set it down behind on the practice field.
I remember in the late 1960s, the ASB president at RA Long organized a protest march where we all walked out of school and marched down Louisiana to the Civic Center in protest, huge protest. What were we protesting? Well, it turned out that there was a bond issue election, a school levy election, and not enough people had actually voted to validate the election. And that was our big protest of the 1960s. I went away to college in 1970 and came back in 1975 to begin my teaching career. And there was a huge amount of change in terms of dress and lifestyle.
Girls could start wearing pants to school. That was important to me because I'd rather be in jeans than a dress. But if you're wearing your pep club sweater, you had to wear, if I remember, you still had to wear a skirt. At that time, the only interscholastic sports in high schools for girls was tennis, swimming, and track. Basketball was not interscholastic. It was considered an intramural sport. The Title IX movement really had a positive impact on girls and women in sports, and I don't think the women would have the opportunities today if it had not been for Title IX.
There were no girls' athletics for a long, long time, and they even had them in the high school a little while before we had them in the Cascade. I started the basketball program for girls, and I also started the girls softball program.
In the late 1970s, there was an enrollment decline, and they had to cut staff. And of course, being a junior staff member, my job was on the line. When the superintendent came and visited me one afternoon and said, Dennis, you have taught a number of different classes designed to help kids who are struggling in school, and we'd like you to consider transferring out to our alternative school. The students named the school, and they named it Natural High, which gets a lot of laughs now, but it really responded to the idea that they were able to leave artificial drugs behind, and through that school experience have a much more positive and meaningful education. We had a unique schedule, and one of the classes we taught was backpacking. We scheduled a trip to a little lake called Blue Lake, which was northeast of Mount St. Helens. The eruption had already begun in terms of little cloud bursts and steam vents and stuff, and they'd established a red zone where you weren't supposed to go. So we were well beyond the red zone, and so didn't think much about it at all, and had this incredibly wonderful time. We hiked in on Friday. The idea was to come back home on Saturday. And about noon on Saturday, the kids gathered together, and there were 4 teachers, and they said, the weather was perfect. They said, we're having such a great time. We think that if we can ration our food, and can we stay over another night? We reluctantly turned the kids down, and we came back Saturday night. Sunday morning, the mountain erupted and wiped out the campsite.
Well, we had heard that the mountain was active, and then when it actually blew, I was a 6th grader at Monticello Middle School. So, you know, the big plume and all the excitement and the worry about whether or not we were safe in Longview, it blew the other side out, so Longview was safe.
We ended up not finishing the school year because of the ash, and they had to have some special dispensation because the seniors did not get enough days in.
I think anytime a president shows up in a small town, it's significant. I know as a 17-year-old kid, on that fall day, it was pretty significant to me. I found out about it only a few days, I felt like, beforehand. You know, Raleigh Johnson called me down into the office and sat me down and said, you know, I was the student body president at the time, but I hadn't been for very long. It was fall, and football season had just started, and we were starting to practice. And you know, he said, well, President Clinton's coming to town, and they want somebody to represent the local student body, and he's going to give the speech here at RA Long, and they want to know if you would do it, you know, if you would introduce Tipper Gore. And I said, well, sure, I will.
One of the things I remember most about it is the Secret Service guys that came in, and they went up into the bell tower and deemed that a perfect location for a sniper, so they boarded the whole thing up so no one would have access up there.
Ty Morris, again, helped me sit down and sketch out a coherent speech, gave me a blazer and a tie, and really kind of set me up, you know, to be ready.
It was a neat experience for our community, and in particular the ASB president, Axel Swanson, who handled it like a champ.
I'm a proud product of the Longview School District. We had a comfortable environment. You know, it was structured, but, you know, for me, you know, all the way from CVG through RA Long, it was always the center of our life. The school growing up here and all the teachers and administrators in it, they really were kind of the center or the focal point, and it wouldn't be fair to them not to really make that point, that that was what bound us together.
We've produced some phenomenal students, and you know, it's credit to our teachers, credit to our administrators.
We had a great time growing up in our community, safe place for kids. I always knew I was going to come back home, and I wanted to teach and coach in the community.
I've got 5 teachers in my family, and I think because they went into education, they must have had some really fine experiences here as well.
A lot of my teachers are still around, which is great, and so I bump into these folks and I'm reminded of them, and at the older I get, the greater appreciation I have for them.
I think that Rich Reeves has adopted the philosophy and a slogan that pride in a rich tradition, and that's exactly what it boils down to in Longview, especially those of us who have been around.
It's a tradition that holds you together and brings the family closer together.
You know, this is the best contract I ever signed.